Good morning, students of Mississippi. My name is Miss Canavan, and I am a first grade teacher at Laurel Magnet School of the Arts in Laurel, Mississippi. Today, I want to start talking to you about what our goals are going to be for our lesson, all right? Because there's three things that by the end of this lesson with me that I really want you to be able to do. The first thing is I want us to be able to locate Egypt on a world map and identify what continent that it is part of. The second thing that I want you to do is I want you to be able to explain the importance of the Nile River and how its floods were important for farming. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. And then the third thing is we're going to start to describe the key components of what a civilization is. So, let's start by going to a world map, all right? The people of the Nile were from an area called Egypt. So let's travel over to Egypt on a map. And we are going to start right here in sweet little Mississippi. That's where we're at, right? And we're going to go all the way over here where this arrow is. We're traveling to the continent of Africa. And the Nile River is part of Egypt. And Egypt is in that right corner of Africa. So, the next thing that we're going to do before we get started is we're going to come back and we are going to go over some really important vocabulary words, because as we're reading our stories, vocabulary is so important. And if we don't know what a word means before we get started, then it's going to be really hard for us to understand what our context is and our content. So, let's come together and let's go with this cool thing called a Freyer model, and he's going to help us learn about these really important words. So, we're going to start with the word enriched. All right, the word enriched means that we are going to add something to something, or we're going to make it richer. All right, so that's what the definition of enriched is. Now, the part of speech that enriched is an adjective, because the word enriched is going to help us to describe things. And in our context, when we read our story, we're going to have this word in context talking about our soil. They had enriched soil because of the Nile River. So, I have my picture here. Is this cool picture of some soil, some enriched soil. And in our Freyer model, we always want to try and use our word in a sentence. So, my sentence, we're going to do this first one together, is the plant was enriched by the sun, because it's in that soil, right? Something was added to it, it was made richer, right? So that is our very first word. Everybody say that word, enriched. Good job. All right, let's do another one together. Our next word is going to be flooding. Have you ever heard that word before? Flooding? Flooding means that it is water covering an area that's usually dry, all right? And that's going to be really important when we start talking about the Nile River in Egypt and the importance of that. That word right there is a verb. That is our part of speech. And here is Miss Canavan's picture of flooding. We have a car and all this water is up in the house, and that's what flooding is, covering an area that is usually dry. Do we normally have water in our house? No. So my sentence for flooding is that there was so much rain that the river was flooding. All right? So that's our second word. We had enriched, and now we have the word flooding. All right? Let's do the next one together. Our next one, and this one is so important for the story that we're going to read. It's probably one of the most important words that we learn today. So our word is Egyptians. Everybody say Egyptians. Good job. So an Egyptian is a person or they're people who are from or they're living in Egypt. And we talked about where Egypt is in the map. It's part of that right corner of the continent of Africa. And we have, that's a noun, that's our part of speech. We have a picture. This is kind of more of a drawing of a picture. But a lot of times when we look at Egyptians, we see these people and they have on white outfits and lots of gold, and they normally have headpieces. So this is a good visual of what back in the day Egyptians looked like. So my sentence says, Cleopatra and King Tut were Egyptians. And those are two really famous people that were Egyptians. Cleopatra, she was a queen, and then King Tut, he was a king. So those are Egyptians. Remember, super important. That word is going to come back up as we read today too. All right? So that's Egyptians. That's our third word. We had enriched, flooding, and Egyptians. Two more words. All right, the next one is advantage. All right, so an advantage, I don't know if you've ever heard somebody say you had an advantage in doing that, but that means there is a skill or things that increase your chance of being successful. Watching this lesson is an advantage to your education. So we have our picture. And again, that is, uh-oh, where did my word go? That is our, it's with my verb. I lost it. That is going to be an adverb, but I can't find my word right now. This is my picture of an advantage. Oh, right here. See how he's kind of above everybody else? He increased his chance of being successful, right? He's above everyone. So my sentence is that the small children had an advantage playing hide and seek. Why did they have that advantage? Because they were small, right? A skill or something that increases their success. So enriched soil, or enriched, we're using it with soil, flooding, Egyptians, advantage, and then one more that we're going to come back to in today's lesson and a later lesson is this word called a civilization. Everybody say civilization. All right, a civilization is a group of people with their own language and way of life. So this is going to become important in both of our lessons. We're going to focus on what makes a civilization. That is a noun. That is my part of speech. And I have a nice little picture here. It has some buildings, some roadways, it's got people. We have our own civilization here in America now, but we're talking today about the Egyptian civilization. So my sentence was the Egyptians had a strong civilization. All right, so those are our 5 vocabulary words that we're going to focus on today. Remember, enriched, let me hear it. Good job. Civilization, Egyptians, flooding, and advantage. So, now that we know where Egypt is, let's talk about the topography that covers Egypt. Let's take a look at a picture. Have you ever heard of a desert? This is a picture of a desert. It's a bunch of sand. There's not a lot of plants. Most of Egypt is covered in a desert, and that desert has a special name, and it's called the Sahara Desert. Can you say Sahara Desert? Good job. So the Sahara Desert is what covers most of Egypt. Now there's another important landmark, and it is called the Nile River. And that's where it says Egypt, ancient Egypt, that green area. That is the Nile River. Let's take a little bit of a closer look. So, the Nile River is actually the longest river in the world, and it flows all the way through Egypt. It is the longest and the mightiest one on earth. So today when we go to read our story, we're going to talk about ancient Egypt and this really important river called the Nile River. Now, the Egyptians had some special advantages that it gave them. And when we read, I want us to be paying attention to see if we can hear some of those advantages that the Nile River gave the Egyptians. All right? And then the Nile River, so since we're still talking about that, he started at the top of Egypt. And that's where a lot of high mountains are. There's a mountain range that's at the top of ancient Egypt. And he's going to flow all the way through it, like we said. And when the rain started, there were lots and lots of rain. It went down the river and it rushed into Egypt. And so it started to flood the flatlands. So when it flooded the flatlands, we had the ability to have crops grown or farming done, right? And a lot of areas in Mississippi, we have farming, right? So in ancient Egypt, they used the areas closest to the Nile River because of the enriched soil. That enriched soil had vitamins and minerals that were deposited into our soil so that the plants could grow. And this is the way that the Nile floods helped our Egyptian civilization, right? However, they weren't always good things that happened from our flood. So, because the flooding happened and they had to live so far away to stay safe, they started making these cool things called canals. And these canals were kind of like roadways for our water to go through, so that the areas surrounding next to the Nile River on the banks, they weren't flooded and people didn't have to move. So I want you to think about this. The Nile River has all this water come down and it floods the areas around it. If you lived there every year, would you want to have to pack all your stuff up and move? That doesn't seem very fun, right? So a lot of Egyptians actually lived many, many miles outside of the Nile River, and they came there to work. So today, we're going to read a story that teaches us all about the ancient Egyptian life several thousand years ago. Now, part of our story is going to be fictional, which means it's fake. We're going to have some characters, we'll have a setting, and then other parts are actually going to be factual or real. So I want you to pay attention to those different pieces in our story as we read it together. And something that I want you to also pay attention to as I read is that many Egyptians said that the Egyptians had been called the gift of the Nile. Egypt itself was called the gift of the Nile. I want you to see if you can find out why they called it the gift of the Nile. So let's go read together. Are you ready? One day, thousands of years ago, an Egyptian woman named Ippy and her daughter Meret went down to the Nile to gather some soft, muddy clay so that they could make clay pots. Approaching the river, they heard a voice call, "Ippy, Meret." They looked up and smiled, for sailing out in the middle of the Nile was Rinzi, the husband of Ippy and the father of Meret. Rinzi was a fisherman who sailed his narrow boat up and down the river, casting out rope nets to catch fish. Rinzi did just as the men in his family had done before him. As Rinzi's mother had told him, once a fisherman, always a fisherman. And once a fisherman's son, always a fisherman too. Rinzi began making his way back to Meret and Ippy, and after a few minutes, he reached shore, pulling up his boat a little way onto the sand so that it would not drift back into the water. He made his way over to them. Meret turned to her father, who hugged and kissed her. "Little fish," he said gently, using one of his nicknames for Meret. The three of them took the rope fishing nets from the boat and hung them to dry on wooden racks in the sun. Then Rinzi, his wife, and his daughter took the fish from the boat back to their village, where they would sell them at market. That night, exhausted from a day at the market, they made their way back to the little house made of mud bricks at the edge of the village. All right, so let's come back and let's discuss some of those story elements that we heard together in our story. All right, so remember we said some pieces were going to be factual and some pieces were going to be make-believe or not real. So who were our characters? That's a story element. That's going to tell me who is in my story, who or what is in my story. So can you think of a character that we just read about in our story? If you said Ippy, that is correct. That was the mother, right? If you said Mirette, that was another character, and that was the daughter in the story. And then our last one, can you remember who the last one was? Rinzi. So Rinzi was the father. So we had 3 characters in our story. We had Ippy, we had Mirette, and we had Rinzi. All right, our next story element, that's our setting. And that word setting means that it's where and when our story can take place. And I want you to think, where did our story take place? I have 2 different places. One of them, if you said Egypt, you're correct, right? Because that's what we're talking about. We're learning all about Egypt. And then if you said the bank of the Nile River, you are also correct. Because we were on the edge, the side of the Nile River. So we could really say 2 different places. We could say Egypt, which remember is on the continent of Africa in that low right-hand corner. Or you could say the bank of the Nile River. All right? Now, I asked you before we started reading to pay attention to what was important from the Nile. So we're going to talk about the benefits that the Nile River gave us, okay? And a benefit means that it's something positive. It's a good thing that came from it. So let's do one of them together. One thing that the Nile River gave the Egyptians was one of our vocabulary words, and that was the enriched soil, right? It had something special. So one of the benefits is it enriched, or it was enriching the soil. It made it so that crops were able to grow every year over and over and over again. All right? I want you to see there were 3 other things that Miss Canavan remembers from the story. Let's see if you remember any of them. All right, if you think back to Rinzi, the father, he did something really cool with some nets. One of the benefits of the Nile was that they were able to go fishing. And when they went fishing, they could do 2 things, right? They could feed their family, or they could go to market and sell them, right? So that's a benefit, right? That's a positive thing that came from the Nile. What about what the boats were getting to do up and down the Nile? What did they get to do? They had transportation, right? Our transportation today is not boats. We use cars and bikes. If you go to school on a bus, right? Sometimes your feet can be a form of transportation too. But back in ancient Egypt, one of the benefits was that transportation. They could use boats to go back and forth places, and it wouldn't take them as long. All right? And the very last benefit that the Nile gave us, that Miss Canavan remembers, is that it had to do with Ippy and Mirette. What did they do at the beginning of the story? They got the clay, right? And they used that clay for making pots. And so they were able to make goods or other things that people would want to buy and bring them to market and make money, right? And that's important, right? We got to make money. So they had 4 benefits. They had enriching the soil. That's when the Nile River flooded, right? And flooded means that the water goes too far. It goes into areas that are usually dry. So it enriched the soil. They were able to go fishing. They had a form of transportation, and they were able to make goods. So let's ask some questions about our story too. Let's see if you can answer these. Why, I asked you this before we started, why is Egypt often called the gift of the Nile? What do you think? If you said it's because of the Nile River, you're right. That Nile River gave them things that they were able to use to establish that civilization, right? That group of people with their own language and way of life. So it's called the gift of the Nile. Egypt is the gift of the Nile because without the Nile, they probably wouldn't be successful, right? It was so important for their civilization. Let's ask another question. How was the flooding of the Nile during those heavy springs in the rain, or the heavy rains in the spring, how were they important for farming? What did it do? I hope you used that vocabulary word we've been talking about. It enriched the soil, right? It gave it minerals and vitamins and nutrients so that they were able to grow their crops over and over again every year and not have to move. Let's ask one more question. I want you to evaluate, right? So these answers might be different. Do you think that Egypt, ancient Egypt, could have existed without the Nile River? If you said yes, why do you think that? And if you said no, why not? I want you to be able to think about that before our next lesson that we have. That one takes a little more time for us to get through because you're evaluating, you're going back to what we read. So, could ancient Egypt have existed without the Nile River? That's for you to decide. So before we end today, let's do a quick activity together. And all you need for this activity are your thumbs. Super easy, right? So we talked about flooding and what that word meant. It can be helpful, but it can also be harmful. And that's because if we had too much water, it could cause damage to our plants or the animals or our homes, right? So I'm going to read you some sentences. If it's a helpful kind of flooding, I want you to put your thumbs up. If it's a harmful type of flooding, what do you think we're going to do with our thumbs? Thumbs down. All right, so let's do the first one together. Flooding provided rich soil for planting crops. That was a helpful type of flooding, right? That enriched soil. I keep using that word. All right, here's the next one for you to do. People living near the river had to leave their homes as the flooding came closer and closer. Do you think that was helpful or harmful? It was harmful, right? You wouldn't want to move every time there was too much rain, right? What about the flooding left clay that was used to make the clay pots? That's a positive one, right? If we think back to our story, that's what Ippy and Moret used. They used that clay to make the goods. Let's do one more together. The birds flew away because the flooding hurt their habitat. That's harmful, right? It hurt their habitat. So if they fly away, that actually hurts things like our ecosystems and our food chains and things like that with science. So, awesome job today, guys. I am so excited that I got to work with you. You worked so hard on our lesson with the people of the Nile. You did such a great job learning about those benefits that the Nile River provided. And I am so proud of you, and you should be proud of yourself too. All of the rights and the credits of this lesson today come from CKLA, and we would like to thank MPB for publicly sharing these valuable resources with you boys and girls. And I cannot wait to keep learning with you next time. I'll see you then.